Good morning, everyone. I'm Brenda Lewis, Senior Member Relations Manager at the Tulsa Regional Chamber, and I'm honored to be joined here today by Kuma Roberts and Yvonne Davis. Kuma Roberts is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Tulsa Regional Chamber. Kuma has worked at the Chamber for more than 8 years in various capacities, and in her current role, Kuma is responsible for driving the Chamber's DEI strategies, as well as cultivating and championing inclusiveness within Northeast Oklahoma's business community. Yvonne Davis is an HR generalist and diversity, equity, and inclusion leader at Luxa Enterprises. In her role as DEI leader, Yvonne supports and develops the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion programs for internal staff and clients. Kuma, I'll pass it over to you to get things started.
Thanks, Brenda. Hi, everyone. As she said, today we're going to talk a little bit about feeling safe enough to soar and how you can use inclusive language to your competitive advantage for your organization. You know, when you pay close attention, it's really hard to miss the fact that gendered words are just a part of our everyday language. For most of my life, I've taken these habits for granted, but moving and living in a society where we are thinking about diversity and inclusion and learning from our community has made me so much more aware of how deeply ingrained gendered language is and just how harmful it can be. Language is a really powerful tool for building inclusion and exclusion at work, and it can be used to create a sense of value and respect in the workplace, or it can create a sense of being undervalued, disrespected, and even make people feel like they're an outsider. Inclusive language enables the diversity of people, their cultures, their backgrounds, their ages, their genders, to feel valued and respected, and they can contribute their talents to drive your organizational performance. You know, let's take a look here at what inclusive language is. You know, the U.S. Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. You know, and for generations, we've been taught that in that context, the word men is meant to include both men and women. But some other common instances of gendered language include words that assume connections between job roles and genders, like policemen or actor and actress. You know, and all of those differ just on the gender of the person doesn't make a ton of sense. So English has changed since that Declaration of Independence, and most readers no longer understand that in the context, the word man is meant to be synonymous with person. So we have to really address how clear communication and clear language makes us more precise and more inclusive in the workplace. So as you can tell, you know, inclusive language is a couple of things. Simply put, it's about effective language, and it's about being respectful, accurate, and relevant to all people. You know, inclusive language is relevant because it involves knowing about and showing respect for all members of our team and those in our workplace. It's accurate because it gives a more accurate view of the real world that we all live in. It reflects the diversity of our society, and it doesn't perpetuate stereotypes. It avoids making false assumptions about stereotypes on people based on their age, religion, culture, gender, and identity. And it's relevant because inclusive language reflects our world's diversity. It's meaningful to a wide audience, and it enables everyone to feel that they are being reflected in what they see and what they hear in the workplace. We all need to see and hear ourselves being reflected in the place that we work. So let's talk a little bit about why language matters. There's a lot of research that talks about the value of using inclusive language in the workplace. How we speak to and how we speak about each other influences how we treat each other, and it builds the workforce culture. So studies show that when you are using non-inclusive language in the workplace, it contributes to what I mentioned earlier, stereotyping. It also harms people who witness it almost as much if it harms those who are its intended targets. When used in job interviews, for instance, non-inclusive language results in applicants feeling excluded from the position. It makes it less attractive for them, and they experience less motivation about wanting to be a part of your team, as well as it hinders them from identifying with those who are not exposed to inclusive language on the front end. Non-inclusive comments in the workplace can have a really insidious effect on the individuals from those excluded groups. I've been a part of that many times in some of the places I've worked, not the chamber. But it really can impede their advancement in the workplace, and it can present them as being potentially incompetent and not suitable for leadership roles. Sometimes we think about that in terms of how we address women in the workplace, and oh, she's emotional, or that woman is just being, she's on her, her monthly, or all of these things that we say that are not intentionally meant to exclude groups, but it does and can make sure that that effect takes place in your workforce culture. And then frequent non-inclusive experiences at work have just as many harmful effects as the most intense ones, like sexual harassment or discrimination. It just is in a different way something that really impedes and becomes a microaggression to feeling their best self and feeling like they belong in the workplace. And then lastly, when we make non-inclusive jokes in the workplace, it can lead to the tolerance of hostile feelings and discrimination against people from excluded groups. I'm going to take a few minutes to talk to you guys about the myths of why this work is important, because I think there's a lot of myths out there in the world. Some of those myths are, I hear a lot, and we'll talk to Yvonne about this in a minute. The myths are, well, people are just too sensitive. It can be really hard to walk in someone else's shoes and understand why they feel excluded by particular words and phrases. It's particularly the case for those of us who've not experienced exclusion, but I certainly have. And it means that when you haven't experienced exclusion, you are less likely to recognize the words, phrases, and incidents that involve bias, stereotyping, and discrimination. But there was an author that once said, making a conscious decision to avoid particular words and phrases, it's not about coddling people or shielding them from offense. It's about chipping away at the idea that alienating people through your language is acceptable in the first place. And we absolutely don't want to create a situation in our workplace where non-inclusive language is tolerable, because all that does for the excluded person is make them not want to be there. The other myth that I've encountered is, gosh, we're all just so PC, right? Politically correct. Like, how do we get away from being so politically correct? And inclusive language isn't about being politically correct. It's about using language, like I said, that is respectful, accurate, and relevant to everyone. The way we work has had to change over time, and in order to keep the pace with many social, economic, and technological shifts, inclusive language at work is just one of the tools your organization can use to respond to these shifts and deliver better business outcomes. And that's what we all want, right? The bottom line to be increased and for us to have better productivity and outcomes. The last myth I want to address with you all today is the myth that there are much more important things your organization needs to be concerned with. I hear that a lot, Yvonne, and I know that you hear it all the time, but I'm here to tell you that when you are embedding and thinking about using inclusive language in your workplace, that you can't be any more of an important topic that you need to address at the time that it happens. Talking about language might seem like a small thing, but changing language is an easy way to create that productive workplace culture that we're all seeking and to create inclusion for everyone. The way we talk about people reflects our workplace culture, and inclusive cultures drive business performance and employee well-being. Unconscious bias can also be expressed through language, so by changing that language, it can really start to dismantle some of the biases that people have internally. It can really wake them up to thinking about their own internal bias. And again, it only contributes to the inclusive nature of the workplaces, and that's what we all seek. So, there are 5 steps to really leveraging and feeling safe enough to soar in your workplace as it relates to using inclusive language. And I'm going to go through those right now. The first step to feeling safe enough to soar is keeping an open mind. I think if you're open to changing what you've always thought as normal or respectful and appropriate to say, means you just don't have to be perfect, but it says that you're willing to learn. And that's something that we all could use, right? Continuous improvement in our workplaces. When you're open to changing what you've always thought is normal, and you're understanding workplace language that happens not only just in your boardrooms, but through the conversational banter that happens at the water cooler, those instances also have an opportunity to exclude people. Try to think and stand in someone else's shoes in those cases and see these situations from their perspectives. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be perfect. All we're asking for is a growth mindset and being open to learn. So the second thing I want to talk about is us needing to focus on the person. Rather than the demographic group that they're a part of, it's only important to refer to a person's age, cultural background, or gender if it's relevant. And we talked about relevancy just a little bit ago. Often it's not necessary to differentiate or single out a person based on their age or cultural background and otherwise. Oftentimes people say that black girl is here for your appointment. It's not necessary. Just say your 9 a.m. appointment is waiting for you. Those are the things that even if someone's trying to apply for a job and they hear that in the waiting room, that can make them feel like potentially they might be excluded moving forward. And we certainly want to avoid that. The next one is that context matters. Language that you use outside of work can be fine, but when you bring it into the workplace, it can certainly create exclusion. Sometimes people use terms about themselves or their friends that are just simply not appropriate for others to use in the context of work. So when I say, hey girlfriend, that is not the kind of term that you want to use in the workplace because it can lead to connotation and other people might feel like they're excluded in that reaction. So let's just be more mindful about how we talk and interact with each other in those cases. The next one I want to talk about is if you are in doubt, simply ask the question. It's really, really easy. If you're not sure what terminology someone prefers, just ask them. This happened to me just yesterday. Someone said, I get confused about African American or black. Which is it? How do I move forward with you? And I said, I appreciate the question. I'm fine with both, but I am black, and you can certainly refer to me as a black woman. Sometimes just asking the organization or the people of the intended group what their preference is can really take a headache from both you and them because you've taken the initiative to be more inclusive in how you language and how you talk about that group. Again, you don't need to know all of the answers. When using language about a group of people, it's just a simple best practice to defer to that group with the lived experience so you understand best how to refer to them. Language is constantly evolving, and it may be necessary to seek advice or more information in situations that are unclear in the workplace. Lastly, and most importantly, I can't stress this enough, in situations where maybe you feel like you've made a mistake and have used language that is not inclusive, I beg you to just keep calm and respond. Respond. Don't freeze up. Don't get paralyzed. Address the situation head on. And I know Yvonne will talk a bit more about that. Sometimes when we operate out of our unintended, unconscious biases, we can say things unintentionally that exclude others, and we don't intend to. If you're called out for not being inclusive, I'm going to share just a few tips that you can respond with, especially when, and we never do, when you didn't mean it like that. Getting called out doesn't mean that you have to immediately jump to defending yourself. And I think that's something that a lot of people get caught up in is, I have to really defend my reaction here and why I said that. And that's not necessary in cases of using non-inclusive language. What it's asking you to do is to not defend yourself by not trivializing that other person's feelings, like saying things like, oh, you're just overreacting, or again, you're just too sensitive. You know, those phrases don't help to build inclusion in the workplace. The next thing is try to understand their perspective. It's really important to put yourself in their shoes and ensure that you are thinking about how you would feel if you'd heard the thing that came out of your mouth. So don't justify your actions. Immediately try to put yourself in your shoes and see where perhaps you might have made your mistake. And lastly, when we say respond, it's important that you say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. And sometimes that can be the hardest thing in a situation when you're sort of being called out, but that goes a long way in terms of building inclusion and a relationship with the person that might feel offended. Say, I'm sorry, it wasn't my intention to offend you. And if you're still confused and if you're still wondering about like what you did wrong, it's perfectly okay to ask them to explain. Can you tell me more about why that upset you? Can you help me be better about about moving forward in terms of building a relationship with you. I'm really excited at this time to be joined by my friend and colleague, Yvonne Davis, who's going to talk with us just a little bit about her work as an HR practitioner in this and how we can be more inclusive in the workplace. Yvonne, let's think a little bit about this and let's talk about what are some of the best practices for promoting inclusive language in the workplace. I talked about just some really high-level overview things, but I think you can get much more specific.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kuma. So I have a lot of good information. So I have my notes here to make sure I don't miss anything. So a really good article that I read was Building Inclusion Through the Power of Language. And through that, I want to offer 3 best practices for being more inclusive through language in the workplace. So number 1, we have to start with ourselves. Pay attention to yourself, right? How are you reacting in that moment? What language are you using in the workplace? We have to be conscious of how our unconscious biases are showing up in our own language. Self-reflection is key and is often the hardest part. We have to remember that we all make mistakes. We're all human, and to be biased is to be human. If you catch yourself, just apologize and move on, and most importantly, try not to make those same mistakes again.
Sorry is the hardest word, right?
Absolutely, yes.
I know it is for me.
Right, and then we want to share our experiences. We know that we all experience the world differently, so be willing to share your experiences with someone else. And then we want to create new habits. By using inclusive language, then by default, we're creating new habits for ourselves. And so I want to offer number 2, say something directly. If you hear someone using language that excludes other people, say something. Be willing to speak up and speak out. Remember, change won't happen overnight, but we have to at least be willing to start the journey somewhere. We want to focus on the behavior. And this is the same in personal relationships. And it's hard at times to not attack that problem where you're racist, you're sexist. But we have to remember that we want to attack the problem, attack the behavior, and not the person. And that can be hard to do. I also want to say, if you're not comfortable having that direct conversation, pull them to the side. You know, be willing to say, hey, I disagreed about what you said earlier. I really want to have a conversation with you. Let's talk about it. And so I want to offer, lastly, say something, but indirectly. Right? And so it may not be as effective as direct behavior, but it's letting someone know that, hey, I noticed the language that you use, it wasn't inclusive, and it's not okay with me. That could look like, ooh, ouch. Tell me how you really feel about it. Well, now that we have our biases out the way, let's move on.
Right.
And so it can look and feel a little bit differently than direct behavior, but you're still putting them on notice that I didn't notice it, and it's not okay.
Yeah, I've used ouch before, especially in arguments with my husband. I'll go, ouch, that
Right.
hurt. And then it's our universal language that kind of didn't sit well with me. And
Exactly.
so I appreciate you mentioning
Yes.
that. So when we're talking about inclusive language, how do we ensure that we have an environment that feels safe for all employees, and how much is inclusive language a factor in that?
So inclusive language is key. It's a huge factor in that. And so inclusive language is key to ensuring that you have a workplace that is safe for everyone. I think it's important for organizations to rethink safety initiatives. We have to move beyond just our concern with physical safety. We also have to be concerned with interaction safety, right? Am I comfortable being me in the workplace? Is it safe for me to be creative and innovative? Is it safe for me to engage, to disagree, to be authentic, to be me in the workplace? And so that's where we want to get to when we're talking about interaction safety in the workplace. And it all starts with communication. Kind of going back to what you said, how you address others, how you talk about others in the workplace. Your word choices, it can impact behavior. And then that behavior in the workplace impacts culture. Right? And so we know that organizations must be intentional on building our culture on purpose. We have to be intentional, because if not, then everything can go rampant, and we have to sit back and say, is this the culture that I had in mind? And if not, it's time to go back to square one and be intentional this time around.
I love the concept the concept of interactional safety, because we think about compliance in our workplaces all the time. I think Sandra Quint says, you know, we need to embed this work of inclusion as a part of safety and compliance. So I love that you mentioned that. Thanks for sharing that.
Yes.
So with the current climate of social unrest as it relates to racism, what can employers do to maintain civility as it relates to hashtags and inclusive language in the workplace?
You know, this is tough. I think with the current climate, the racism going on right now, I feel it calls for courageous managers. We have to have managers with the courage to call it as they see it, right? This is a time for organizations to create inclusive cultures, which starts off with inclusive language with their employees and being inclusive on purpose. Because if not, then you're going to have exclusion by default. So language is powerful, and it can make your employees feel included or excluded in the workplace. Again, you know, certain things we have to be mindful of what we're doing, and I'm going to do this on purpose every now and again. We have to check in with ourselves to see how I'm doing. Am I making others feel as if they belong? Are my word choices making others feel they truly belong here, that they are accepted, respected, and they can feel connected to the workplace? So, you know, as we know, things that happen in our communities happen to the employees that work in our organizations. And as much as we would like to, you know, we can't always check those things at the door. Those things bleed into the workforce. And so it's important for managers to have the tools and resources to deal with these challenges head on.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's just really critical that organizations today create safe spaces to have these conversations, right? Without that safe space, anything could happen. You know, not being mindful of intent versus impact. And so we want it to be a safe environment.
And I'm going to give you a plug on that because Yvonne hosts courageous conversations all the time, routinely throughout the year. And they have topics around inclusivity in the workplace, beyond the hashtags, and some of the things that are really important that help make your culture more inclusive. So I'm going to give you that because I really enjoy your sessions.
Thank you. So we know employers must ensure their workspace is a safe space for employers to speak up. Because we do want people talking about race. I mean, with diversity, there are so many dimensions to it, and race is just one, but race is a factor that many shy away from, because when we bring up race, it's not saying that I believe you're racist, right? It's something that we have to talk about. And so we want people to talk about it more, but we want them to talk about it more effectively and with kindness. You know, as we learn these tools and resources in the workplace, and we take that home with us, which can impact our families, which in turn can impact our communities. And so how organizations define their values when it comes to anti-racism, that also determines how they deal with that, how they battle that in the workplace. So racism left unchecked, it can be harmful to any organization. So we want people talking about it, but we want it to be a safe space, and we want to have effective and courageous conversations. And so I think an important first step to dealing with racism in the workplace is to listen first, right? Not to be willing to invalidate other people's experiences. And that's key, because we know as a Black woman, I face this world, my experience is different from that of a white woman. You know, and so we have to be willing to listen to our employees, listen to their experiences, listen to the stories, and sometimes see the tears that show you that something is wrong. And it's time, you know, that we no longer disengage in issues that don't impact us personally.
And think about turnover and retention numbers within your organization. So often, you've probably experienced this, I get calls from companies that say, we have a great benefits package, we offer incredible salary rates, but I can't keep people of color. What is it? And I go, it's probably your inclusive language. It's probably the culture that isn't fostering that environment in your workplace. So it's something to think about for sure.
We got to be willing to listen to it, and then we have to be willing to acknowledge that something is going on, and then to start somewhere. Where can I fix it? I think a lot of times with companies, from what I'm seeing, that they may have a D&I, diversity and inclusion initiative, but then there may be, you know, issues with race. You know, that doesn't negatively impact the organization, because we can't change each individual in that organization, but it's one person at a time. And so I always say it's important to build consensus around the problem.
Yes.
Listen,
Love that.
and then start somewhere, because we're all in different spaces with our journeys. Every organization, there is no one size that fits all when it comes to diversity and inclusion initiatives. What works for one company, what works for Luxa may not work for another company. So you have to be willing to start somewhere. And then organizations may not be able to change the world, but they can change their workplace, their world. And so in essence, we are changing our communities one world, one organization at a time.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I think that you have definitely helped me feel safe enough to soar in the workplace as it relates to inclusive language.
Yes.
I cannot thank you enough for joining me today.
Thank you. I
It's always a
appreciate
pleasure
it.
to see you,
Thank
even in the time
you.
of COVID. I value
Yes.
you so much.
Thanks, Kuma.
Thank you. Brenda, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you both for that fantastic dialogue and for being here today. And thank all of you for joining us virtually.